Hi. In today's workshop, we'll be diving into an important topic: how to find a relationship therapist or an individual therapist, particularly if you're dealing with difficult or destructive communication patterns in your relationship, or if there's narcissistic abuse or any form of emotional abuse. Not all therapists have the training to be able to work with this population. They may not be trauma informed, which is also essential. So we're going to talk about that and why it's so important. We're also going to explore how to shop for a therapist. Yes, you get to shop for your therapist, and how to vet a therapist. We want to cover really important questions that you need to ask them before you engage in therapy, as well as red flags to look for when it might be time to stop therapy. So you'll learn why these things are so important, and also the kind of therapy that you need to support you as a survivor, to support you, to support your growth, to support your strength, to empower you, and to receive the empathy that you need and deserve. Okay, let's get started. I'm Annette Oltmans. I'm founder and CEO of the Mend Project. In today's workshop titled How to Choose a Therapist Who Truly Understands Abuse, we're going to cover a lot of material. And it's not just only for a therapist who understands abuse, but a therapist who understands trauma and difficult relationships or destructive relationships. So we'll get into that. I want to set the stage and outline our goals for this webinar a little bit, because we're going to cover a few things. I'll begin by encouraging you to shop for a therapist. Yes, you have the right to shop for a therapist. What I found is that so many individuals will feel that every therapist is qualified. They perceive them as a person in an authoritative position, someone that they need to follow and listen to. But I want you to think more openly about it. They are human beings. They bring their biases, their family history, and their training or lack of training into your session. And so you really want to take the time to shop for a therapist. I shopped for 11 therapists before I chose the one that I landed on, who I felt was competent to deal with complex post-traumatic stress. So I just want to empower you. The next thing you want to do is really learn how to vet a therapist in this process. You want to be able to ask them about their qualifications. You want to know the specific questions to ask them that are relevant to you. So we're going to cover specific questions that you need to ask them. We want to make informed decisions about therapy because you want to take control over your healing journey. I know that you don't feel in control, especially if you're still in the thick of it. You may feel emotionally compromised or fragile or weak, but that's okay. You still can advocate for yourself. So I want you to feel empowered, and I hope that this workshop will help you feel that. And I'm going to just give you a quick overview of other things that we talk about relating to therapy as we go through. But before we jump in, I would love to hear from you. Have any of you felt that you were betrayed by a therapist, or that your therapist just wasn't getting it? Or maybe you felt blamed for things that you didn't believe were your responsibility, or that you weren't progressing. Maybe they just weren't trained enough. And I want to know what that felt like. I would like to know what your experiences are. That'll help us see where we all are and relate to one another. So go ahead and drop those comments. So understanding abuse and its impact on therapy is really important. You want to work with a trauma-informed therapist because they will understand how abuse dynamics not only impact you on the receiving end, whether the offender is deeply entrenched in their faulty beliefs and thinking, whether it's really a characterological problem or whether it's bad habits, it still has a very negative impact on you. And they need to recognize that. And a trauma therapist will. You may have trust issues with your therapist. You may have a hard time establishing trust. It usually takes some time, but particularly if you have post-traumatic stress or you've been in an abusive relationship where everything is so manipulative and confusing, it causes you to be hypervigilant, where you want to be sure that the therapist is aligned with you. So you ask them questions. And a good therapist won't get on the defensive. They will be able to tolerate their own defenses as you ask them these pointed questions about whether they are fully aligned with you or not. Those are fair questions to ask. And you should always be able to count on a therapist who's understanding that you're going to have trust issues and that you are going to be hypervigilant, that you're going to be anticipating a traumatic experience to happen in therapy. They need to be compassionate, empathic, and patient with you about that. Covert emotional abuse, which is, we have overt emotional abuse and we have covert emotional abuse. And the overt emotional abuse is the name calling, put downs, the raging. Maybe it involves punching walls or destroying property. Things of that nature. That's one thing, but that most of us can identify is destructive. If they don't get that, then you seriously need to leave your therapist and move on to somebody else. But what you really want is somebody who understands covert emotional abuse, those hidden, manipulative, confusing tactics that a narcissist will employ against you. You want them to be able to identify and properly name those behaviors. And you want them to see the patterns of behavior, because even one destructive behavior repeated in a pattern is enough to be destructive to the whole relationship. Consider if somebody is just lying to you, and I don't mean just, but they're lying to you, but they're not doing anything else. You can see how lying would completely undermine the relationship. If somebody is continually gaslighting you, it too will undermine the relationship. So the therapist needs to be able to understand and see when gaslighting is occurring, or when blame shifting is occurring, or minimization, catastrophizing, which means blowing things out of proportion. They need to be able to recognize those things, because their job is to help you gain clarity. You want to be able to name these behaviors, because that enables you then to anticipate those behaviors in your next difficult conversation with your partner, so that, and when you anticipate them, you can not fall into the vortex of craziness. You can take a step back and disengage from the conversation and refuse to communicate when those tactics are being employed against you. So you want them to be able to, you want the therapist to really understand how confusing it is, help you get clarity, to not be confused themselves, because a lot of therapists get as confused as you do in these circular conversations. You want someone who has the expertise, who has been trained to be able to pick up on those things in pretty short order, maybe 1 or 2 sessions, to be able to see. It shouldn't be something that goes on and on for months or even weeks. They should be able to identify it early. And if they aren't, then you're not with somebody who has the skill set to be able to help you. You also want somebody who's going to recognize that couples therapy has risks. In fact, if any form of abuse is present, couples therapy is contraindicated, meaning it's not recommended. And there's a number of reasons for this. I think I'm going to get into that in just a little bit, so I'll move on. But we're also going to discuss risks of secondary harm. What if the therapist doesn't align with you? How traumatic is that? like the person who said that she felt that her husband was a narcissist and confided that in the therapist, and then the therapist turns around and repeats it. That is not aligning with you. That's not protecting you. Whenever there's a thought that there could be a victim of narcissistic abuse, the therapist needs to 100% align with the person on the receiving end. There should be no question about that. And so betrayal, when you experience it from a therapist, is actually a form of double abuse. It's that secondary layer of harm that happens so often when victims or survivors will finally get the courage to speak up or reach out for help, and then people don't believe them or don't protect that disclosure. They don't validate them. They may criticize them or give them unwanted advice when they can't possibly know what you're going through. So it's someone that you want to be really emotionally safe and alert about all these behaviors. You don't need to go through an experience of double abuse where your trauma will be exacerbated and where it will hijack your relationship dynamics. It will embolden the abuser, which is highly traumatic. So we want somebody who's skilled, and we want to avoid couple therapy other than an assessment. But we'll talk about that in a minute too. In couple therapy, it's not a mutual problem. Abuse is a choice. It's not a mistake, and it's never the victim's fault. That's a saying that we say at Mend quite often. You want someone who understands that on the survivor side, you bear no responsibility in the abuse. You might be participating in the dance because you haven't quite recognized all the tactics being used against you so that you can disengage, or so that you can set firm boundaries. You might not have that skill set yet, but you need somebody who's not going to be viewing the situation as though it's a mutual problem, where they say things to you like, well, why did you say that when you knew that would make he or she angry? That's placing responsibility on you, or saying, well, your reaction was just as bad as the initial abuse. Reactions are part of an involuntary traumatic response. They're not motivated to power over and control. So reactions should never be treated as like mutual abuse, or where both people are abusing. It is not a mutual problem. And that's the problem with couples therapy, is therapists align with both. They believe they need to align with both parties. And that just doesn't work when any form of abuse is present. You have to resolve the abuse first. You have to not only resolve it, reparations need to be made commensurate with the harm that they've caused you. And you need to see a complete change of behavior. It needs to be resolved before any other problems in the relationship can be identified, where couples therapy might then be helpful. There's initial work that has to take place first. So couples therapy isn't all bad, but when you're discovering abuse, it should just be an assessment, and where they interview you, they interview your partner, then they might have the three of you together in one session, where they can then see the dynamics. That's an assessment. Beyond that, couples therapy should be stalled until abuse is resolved. And abuse usually doesn't get resolved. It requires so much work on both of your parts, mostly on the abuser's part, to unravel their thought processes, their faulty thinking, which we talk about in another workshop. And you can go to our website where we talk about the pillars of abuse, the things that make up the mindset of the abuser. Those things need to be unpacked broken down and then built up in a healthy way. And that takes a long time. And most offenders don't want to go through the work to do that. They don't even see that they have a problem, let alone go to that kind of intensive therapy and taking on all that responsibility to admit that their entire worldview is faulty. So I lost my train of thought for a second, but hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now I want to talk about questions to ask a therapist. But first, I just want you to know that I think I touched on this in the beginning, that you have the right to shop for a therapist. So your first approach should really be to call the therapist, see if they give free consultations, and just tell them openly, I'm shopping for a therapist. So I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you. Just let them know you have every right to ask them these questions. You need to take control over your own therapy. You are hiring them. They are serving you. You are not serving them. And I think there's a dynamic that often takes place, particularly with victims and survivors, where they're so broken down, they're so vulnerable, they lack self-esteem, they lack confidence, they lack agency. And so they don't realize that they have every right to drive these discussions and to make a choice and to leave therapy if it's not going well. If something doesn't sit well with you, you talk to the therapist privately about it right away, see if they are defensive or not, see what they're going to do to correct it, and then decide if you're going to stay or leave. You have every right to do that. So these are some, let's just talk about some questions to ask. The first thing I would ask is, what is your education and training, particularly when it comes to difficult, challenging, destructive communication styles, confusing conversations where it seems like the conversation goes in circles and it doesn't ever move to a resolution. Those should be signs that the therapist understands you're dealing with narcissistic abuse. They should be able to pick up on that and give you that feedback. So you want to ask them their experience. You want to ask them if they have experience, if they not just have experience, but if they have experience and training in domestic violence or narcissistic abuse. What continuing education classes have they taken? How long ago did they take them? How many did they take? You want to know everything about their training. And it's very fair to ask those questions. If they say, I haven't had training, and let's say you don't have a lot of resources in your area to choose from, if they had a narcissistic parent, then maybe they would be able to still understand your dynamics. But these are fair questions you can ask them about their background, about their, you want just a synopsis, a 30-second synopsis of their story, because they all come with something. And so they could be qualified, but I prefer somebody who has been properly trained with continuing education courses. You want to ask them how long their sessions are. If they're only 40 minutes, it's not going to be enough. And a lot of therapists operate on a 40-minute timeline. So I usually just move on beyond that person. You want to ask them if they're available for emergency phone calls. What is their availability off hours? You want a therapist who's available. That's their job. They're your advocate. And if they're unavailable or have strict boundaries on after-hour times, I would recommend, I don't think they're fully invested in their work, and I would recommend that you choose somebody else. You want to ask them their fees. You want to understand if they take insurance or not and exactly what you're getting into. You also want to ask them about the trauma training that they've had, specifically recurring relationship trauma, not just a single event trauma, not to minimize single event trauma, but you want to know that they understand the recurring nature of ongoing trauma and its impact on the person on the receiving end. If they've had continuing education if they're trauma informed and they have education, they're going to better understand your symptoms when you react, or when you're hypervigilant, or when you're involuntarily shaking, or when you're having a hard time communicating because of fragmented thinking and communication, all effects of PTSD. You want someone to really understand and see what that is for what it is, and not assume, like the person said, borderline personality disorder, or that you're emotionally unstable in some other way. You want them to see that this is the impact that abuse and trauma is having on you. So you want them trained. You want to be able to talk to them about their approach. So it's important to say, how do you define abusive behavior in a relationship? What do they define as abuse? Is it strictly physical violence, or do they understand emotional abuse? Do they only understand overt emotional abuse, or do they understand covert, the hidden forms of abuse? These are important questions that will give you insight whether they're going to be able to meet your needs. You don't want to have to train a therapist. Although we do have a course that I recommend that you advise your therapist to take. It is a professional course sanctioned by the American Psychological Association that teaches them about how to respond to abuse in therapy, and how to respond to the abuser if they have any interactions with them. And it teaches them to fully align with the victim. It gives them a lot of insight. So if your resources in your area are limited, they can take our course and get a comprehensive education about abuse, and they get their continuing education units taken care of. You can ask them, do you feel that destructive communication issues or emotional abuse is a mutual responsibility problem? Some therapists think that all relationships are mutual, and that there's 50-50 or 100% responsibility in all relationships. And I say that's really only an appropriate viewpoint in healthy relationships where there's not abuse dynamics. You want to ask them, how would you handle it if you identified abuse? What would they do? What would their behavior be like in therapy in the moment? Would they name it, what it was? Would they want you to discover it on your own by leading you to discovery, by providing you information? You want to know what their strategy is. How would they respond to it? What if you were in couples therapy and they recognized it? Would they say it in front of both parties? You may be in a place where you want it stated in front of both parties, and you may be in a place where you don't. So those are things that are important to talk about. You want to ask them about cultural and religious sensitivity. If you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish, you're going to have a different context that you bring to the perceptions around marriage, for example. And you want to know that they are culturally sensitive, that they understand the written scriptures that you may be influenced by, or that your partner may be abusing to control you. You want them to understand that. Let's say you're part of an ethnic culture where machismo is a theme throughout the culture. You want to ask them, how are you going to handle that? This is abusive behavior, but my partner thinks that it's normal and that they're entitled to it based on our cultural background, but it's not acceptable. It's destructive. How are you going to handle that cultural contradiction? That you're going to be, are you going to contradict that cultural belief? How are you going to do that? You want to talk about safety and boundaries. How are they going to ensure your emotional safety? The therapist that revealed that she felt her husband was a narcissist, that is not emotional safety. Your safety is really important if you're being abused. not just physical safety, but your emotional safety, because we all know the retaliation and the chaos that narcissists can create. And so you want to make sure that they understand what that would do to you if they betray you. You want to ask them, what do you think is a good therapeutic outcome for survivors? What are their objectives? Are they there to help you get stronger? Are they there because they have an agenda that they want you to leave or they want you to stay? You want to find out what most therapists don't talk to you about objectives, because what often happens is if you're early in the processing, you might not be ready to hear the kind of work. Let's say you are really desperately trying to save your marriage, but the therapist identifies that it's probably not likely based on how entrenched the abuser's behaviors are. They're going to be a little reluctant to say, I want to get you stronger so you feel confident to leave. That wouldn't sit well with you because you weren't ready to hear that yet. So you want a therapist that will talk to you about objectives. Like, I just want to help you get stronger. I want you to find your voice. I want you to love yourself and believe in yourself. You want to know that they know what their objectives are. You don't just want talk therapy where you go in and you're expressing your situational issues week after week after week, where nothing bigger gets resolved and the underlying issues don't get resolved. So you want to know what their objectives are. And you want to be able to pick up on red flags. Do they minimize the abuse? Do they say that wasn't so bad? Or, oh, my husband does that all the time? Or any way that they minimize it? Or don't you think you overreacted there? If you've been experiencing the same behavior over and over for years, you're going to react. You're fed up. It might seem out of context to that one situation, but when you consider the pattern, the longstanding recurring trauma that's been happening, it makes perfect sense. And so you want a therapist who's not going to minimize the abuse, and that they're going to recognize the patterns. They're going to recognize the impact on you, and that it's systemic abuse that you're dealing with, not just that situation. So those are red flags to look for, where it may be time to leave, because if they minimize abuse in front of an abuser or even alone, it emboldens the abuser. It undermines your self-confidence. And if it's done in front of the abuser, it emboldens them. And so it has a really negative effect on your relationship and on your goals for your therapy. Do they use statements like, using the word abuse is too harsh, so we're not going to use that word in session? Do they say that to you? If so, then I recommend that you run, not walk, to a different therapist. They might say, I don't believe in labels like narcissism. Same difference. I would run and not walk. That means they think that they can deal with the issue of narcissism in couple therapy, or they're not willing to validate your experience in individual therapy. So that would be a red flag. If they ask you questions like, why did you stay so long? That is really a toxic question to ask you. It puts you on the defensive suddenly, and you should never feel on the defensive. You want to feel supported. You want to feel cared for. You want to experience their empathy. You want to experience their encouragement to help you get stronger, their belief in you. You want to know that they're fully aligned with you. So when they ask you, I remember interviewing those 11 therapists, and I was particularly interested in if they understood complex post-traumatic stress. And this one gentleman said, oh, yeah, I've worked with a lot of people with CPTSD. And then he starts interrogating me. Why did you stay so long? Why didn't you do this? Or have you tried that? Or all these things that just put me on the defensive, clearly showing that they were not trauma informed, because you would never do that to a trauma victim. You would meet them where they are and not make these assumptions. It just shows so much ignorance. It's actually called over confronting. We have this saying at Mend where we say, for therapists, don't over confront, but don't under inform. So inform them by providing them resources and information to educate them, but don't over confront them and start interrogating them or labeling things before they're ready to hear it. Maybe you aren't ready to recognize that you're actually a victim of abuse. You're just trying to find it out. There's ways that therapists can provide information and data for you to help you discover it on your own, so that you're not getting this, you're being abused, strong emotion that's more than you're ready to hear at the time. You want to see if it doesn't sit well with you in your gut, then listen to your gut, because they don't know what they're doing. You will know if it sits well with you or not, if they're betraying you, if they're minimizing you, if they are not helping you get stronger, if they're not aligning with you and fully supporting you, if they're doubting you or interrogating you. Those things shouldn't sit well with you, and they won't. And so it's perfectly okay to see that as a red flag and to leave therapy. If you want, you can confront the therapist right then and there and see how they respond. But I would mostly say they've revealed how little they know about your topic, and so it's probably time to move on. You want to know how they're going to respond to the he said, she said dynamics. So often there's false accusations that the abuser makes. Maybe he writes the therapist a letter, if you're in individual therapy, and it paints a very false narrative about what occurred. How are they going to respond to those he said, she said situations if you haven't yet gained enough knowledge to be able to articulate what's really happening? False accusations, anybody will say it's hijacking, to be accused of molestation or accused of stealing or accused of anything. It's very chaotic emotionally, and it puts you on the defensive. And so they need to be able to see through those things and not join in the false accusation and require you to explain and prove why you're not guilty of the accusation. You want them to be able to recognize, okay, they're falsely accusing you. They are presenting a false narrative to undermine your therapy. And I totally see it for what it is. You don't want them to just break down everything in the letter the person, your spouse, wrote to undermine you. You want them to see it for what it is. You want them to be your advocate. A good therapist may accompany you to a meeting with your attorney, or may be willing to make a phone call to your pastor or your church leader if you're experiencing double abuse in that environment, if you want them to. You want somebody who's willing to see that their role in your life, they may be the only person you have to stick up for you. I don't always recommend going back to people who've doubly abused you, because I think they're very entrenched in their thoughts and they're not likely to change. But you want somebody who's willing to do that if you ask them to. So that's just a few of the questions that you can ask. But what I really want you to do after this workshop is to go to our blog. We're going to put the blog on this subject in the chat, because it gives comprehensive questions and insight as to what's behind that, so that you can feel really informed to see it in writing. It'll be really helpful for you. So now that we've touched on ways that therapy can go wrong, I want to look at some ways healthy therapists would really look like. So a good therapist is capable of naming specific abusive behaviors. They're going to be able to say, they're going to use the proper language. They're going to say, that's gaslighting, that's catastrophizing, that's countering, that's minimization, that's undermining. They're stonewalling you. They're blocking you in conversations. They're overly defensive. They're not allowing you to speak, to have your voice. You want them to be able to name those things, to give you the language so that you gain the clarity. Now, we provide clarity education through our course, which I highly recommend that you take. In fact, so many victims and survivors who have taken the course say it saved them about a year in therapy. It's a comprehensive education so that you can really gain the information that you need to then work on your self-esteem and your healing and some of the other more important aspects of therapy. But if you're in this situation where you're still processing and ruminating and perseverating, whatever word you want to use to describe that, you're still thinking and needing to talk about situations that occurred because you're confused, you want a therapist who can use the proper language to really support you in gaining that clarity. Let's see. Let me check my notes here. You want to experience their full support and empathy. I know I've said that before, but a good therapist, a healthy therapist, will understand their role and will have a tremendous amount of empathy for you. And they'll treat you with sensitivity and kindness and compassion. You want a therapist that uses evidence-based modalities in their treatment plan. So, for example, there's dialectical behavioral therapy that's really helpful for survivors, or internal family systems. That's where you discover different parts within yourself, your child part, your adult part, and which parts have wounds that need to be talked about so that you can find your self-identity again, so that you can maybe you'll find your identity in ways that you never have in the past. Oftentimes, our childhood experiences impact how we feel about ourselves and what we feel our self-worth is. And if we haven't looked at those childhood issues, it sometimes can groom us to choosing somebody that is abusive or narcissistic or whatever. It sets you up for that. So it's really important work to get into that. And a good therapist won't push you, but they will know how to encourage you to see the relationship between the past and the current and the future. Emotionally focused therapy is definitely contraindicated. It's a really popular form of therapy. It's where you share your vulnerabilities with your partner. They share their vulnerabilities and your prior traumas so that you can support each other and actually be a partner in your healing. But an abuser can never do that. If you share your vulnerabilities, they're going to exploit those vulnerabilities, either in private or in public at times. They're not responsible enough. They're overpowering you. They're wanting to control you. They're not wanting to support you. And I mean, I'm sure all of you who have been in an abusive relationship realize a lack of empathy that you're receiving from your partner. They're not going to suddenly become empathic. So stay away from emotionally focused therapy. It was developed by Dr. Susan Johnson. Even in her textbook, she says it's not meant for couples who are separated or when any form of abuse is present. But a lot of therapists don't know this. This is why we interview a therapist to really ask them. If somebody tells you, I operate under emotionally focused therapy, you want to run, not walk away from that person. I want you to take actionable steps to find your agency and to be a good self-advocate for yourself. and not settling for ineffective therapy. There's no reason that you need to do that. And I'm hoping that you're gleaning that from this talk today. You want to vet therapists thoroughly and take advantage of free consultations. You want to consider online therapy. If you need a good therapist, we have some online therapists that are trained, and you can write to us at info@themendproject.com and we can give you some options. I encourage you to take our course. It's called Finding Clarity and Healing in Difficult, Confusing, or Abusive Relationships. It's that course that I was talking about. That's wonderful. That will give you a comprehensive education, because actually clarity is the first step to healing. And what gives you clarity is education. And so I really encourage you to take this course. As I come to a close, I just want to say that everybody here at the Men Project wishes you a wonderful holiday season. We know that the holidays are often really difficult. Narcissists create chaos at every birthday and holiday. So we know that you're probably going to be experiencing some of that, or maybe it's some isolation. But we just want you to know that we love you, we care about you, and we want you to have the best experience possible, and know that this season is temporary. You're not going to be here forever. You're traveling through a journey and you're going to get stronger. And how could I forget this? Prioritize you during this holiday season. Put yourself first. Take really good care of yourself. That's your assignment. Take really good care of yourself. Okay, until next time. Bye-bye.